Okay, we're going to start the last class of Between the Testaments. And we're going to get us all the way to the days when the Messiah will come into the world. And mostly focus on Herod the Great and who he was and how history played out for him to become the king of the Jews. So we talked a little bit about him in the end of the last class. He was an Edomite, as we talked about. He sort of took advantage of Hyrcanus and Artabalus's problems with each other, the conflict that they had over the high priesthood in Jerusalem. He had brought Hyrcanus back out of Arabia, brought him back down into Jerusalem. Anyway, so he's positioning himself and really is fixated on becoming the king of Judea. So the Roman forces have helped him. He's aligned himself with particularly Mark Antony among the Romans, who was one of the generals who, after Caesar's death and after Caesar's execution and murder, is sort of seen as one of the leaders. He and Octavian really are the ones that are leading the Roman powers at this point. So Herod and the Romans run the Parthians out of Jerusalem in 37 BC. So we're 37 years out from the birth of Christ. Now the Parthians had come into Jerusalem and invaded Jerusalem at the end of the last class. Now the Parthians were the people that were in the eastern part of the old Greek Empire. They are the Persians, they are the Indians, they are that big, large section of area that was the Persian Empire. And they are off to the east. And they also have taken an interest and are pushing back against the Romans taking them. Now they're eventually swallowed up into the Roman Empire, but they are in Jerusalem at this point, and Herod and the Romans run them out. So Herod's rule spanned really from about 37 BC to 4 BC. And so he had a very eventful ruling, years of ruling. He was the king that feared the birth of Jesus. He worried that the king of the Jews that he heard about was a great rival for him, and therefore he's the one that had all of the infants in Bethlehem just killed. So the 4 BC, just to make sure that we understand, the birth of Jesus and the time of going from BC to AD on the Georgian calendar is a little fuzzy. He actually ruled a little bit past that. He was the king when Jesus was born, and he is the king that was concerned about Jesus. And he was the king that had the babies in Bethlehem killed. When Jesus and his family returned back from Egypt, he is no longer, he has died. And so that's kind of the point of time when he will die. And so that is Herod the Great. So he's ruling 30 years out from when Jesus is born. Well, he does a couple of things. He appoints Hananiel to be the high priest. Now, Hananiel, a man named Hananiel was Babylonian. And of course, Herod, though he's the king of the Jews, has really not an understanding of the law. He really doesn't care about the lineage of Aaron, nor does he really care about the true purity of worship. So he appoints this Hananiel as the high priest. He's married to Mariamne, and Mariamne is the daughter. If you look at the slide, she's the daughter. Do you remember when the daughter of Hyrcanus and the son of Aristobulus married? They were Alexander and Alexandra. Well, Mariamne is the daughter of that union. And so she actually is a Hasmonean princess. She actually is a descendant of the Maccabees. And so Herod is thrilled to marry this Hasmonean princess. It strengthens his claim for the throne. He is happy to have that marriage and that union, which will solidify, his being part of this ruling piece of the Jewish nation. Mariamne's mother, Alexandra, resented this new high priesthood terribly. Of course, as you realize, she's the descendant of Hyrcanus, and of course, Hyrcanus was the high priest, came back into Jerusalem and was the high priest. And she determines that her grandson, Aristobulus, should be the grandson of, and he would have been the grandson of Hyrcanus, should be the proper high priest. He should be the one that's the high priest. So Alexandra communicates with Cleopatra in Egypt. Remember, there's quite a strong bond there. And she sends word for Cleopatra to influence Antony and to bring pressure upon Herod. So Mark Antony, who Herod is so loyal to and so worried to appease, he's very concerned. He wants to keep his relationship with Mark Antony strong because, of course, that is what his kingship hinges on. So now Mariamne, his wife's mother, is involved in all this. She sends a message to Cleopatra, and she asks that Cleopatra ask and intervene for her and ask Mark Antony to put some pressure on Herod. So Cleopatra is successful. She applies this pressure on Antony. He removes Hananiel from the office of high priesthood. And Aristobulus is named the high priest. So now Alexandra has her way. Her grandson, who's a descendant of Hyrcanus, is now the high priest. Herod and Alexandra are really, they get along. Actually, Herod gets along with Alexandra. He finds that relationship that he has with that Hasmonean, those Maccabees, to be powerful for him. But he hears one day that she has gone around him and communicated directly with Cleopatra. And he is furious. And he no longer trusts Alexandra, his mother-in-law, and he insists that she remain in the palace. He has guards watching her all the time. They watch everything she does, everything she says. Alexandra and her son Aristobulus try to escape. They both try to escape. Of course, Aristobulus is acting as a high priest. They get into these coffins that are going to be transported out to Egypt, and they climb in these coffins and they hope to escape. But some of the guards of Herod find them and bring them back to the palace. Well, of course, then Herod just goes nuts because, of course, something that's underlying in all of the Herods always was an insecurity because they never were rightfully, to the Jewish population that they ruled over, they were never rightfully the kings. And so while they placated to the power, to the Romans, because they're the ones that could keep them there, they were very insecure in what the Jews might do or think. So Herod was greatly threatened by Aristobulus. And now that he knows of the attempted escape of he and and Alexandra, his mother, he is watching them very closely, and he's very concerned. So, because Herod was an Edomite, he knew that he was not the favored king for the Jews. Well, one day Aristobulus drowns while he's bathing. And there is no question that most people, including Aristobulus's family, believe that Herod is the instigator of the drowning. They believe he's murdered. They believe Herod has murdered him. And so Alexandra, through ways of communication and messengers, gets word to Cleopatra and once again requests for her to intervene on her behalf. She tells Cleopatra what's happened. She believes that Herod has killed her son, and Cleopatra then goes to Mark Antony. Now, Mark Antony there's no question, he was very susceptible to any request that Cleopatra makes. So he commands that Herod appears before him to answer for his crime. And he sends for Herod, and he has Herod come to Rome. Well, Herod knows that this could not end well. And Herod is on his way to Rome to meet Antony, knowing that Antony has heard the news that Aristobulus has died, and he's not feeling good about things. And so he has an uncle named Joseph. And he asked this uncle named Joseph, he says, now listen, if I don't return, I want you to make sure that Mariamne is killed. I want to make sure that she does not live. I want to make sure that she is not the one who will then control and the priest, not only the priesthood, but even a kingship could go back to her descendants and be back in the hands of the Maccabees. Well, he doesn't die. He's not killed. Mark Antony does not kill Herod. Herod gets his way out, makes his way out of it. Now, while he's away from Jerusalem, he's gone long enough that people in Jerusalem begin to think that he is dead, but he isn't dead. And he comes back, and upon his return, Mariamne tells Herod that she's heard while he's gone. She's heard all about his plan to kill her. It is interesting that she's heard somehow, and she has not been killed. So whether or not Joseph just thought this is ridiculous, I'm not going to do this, whether or not he didn't carry out the plans and the wishes of Herod, I don't know that. But she doesn't die, and when he gets back, she just confronts him with the fact that he has ordered for her to be killed. And Herod then concludes, based off that, well, then surely this means that you and Joseph have had an adulterous relationship while I've been gone. That's the only way you would possibly know this, is if Joseph was in love with you and he didn't want to kill you and he told you this. And so he has Joseph killed, his uncle. Mariamne is saved because of Herod's love for her, is what he declares. Herod has another problem there shortly after that, and that is Octavian, or Augustus. He really has a crisis, and it's related to this struggle within the Roman Empire between these two generals that had been Caesar's generals when he was killed. So beginning in about 32 BC, Octavian and Mark Antony really both set their sights on the Roman Empire, on ruling the Roman Empire. Herod was a protege of Antony, and he actively supported Antony. He actively bid for him to be in control. There was no question that he laid his alliance out there. Everybody knew where his alliance was. And Antony needed a buffer state in the east because he needed to be protected against these Parthians who kept trying to march across and take back the portions of the Roman Empire that lie just east of Palestine. So Herod successfully fights the Arabs. He successfully holds that Palestinian area for Antony, and the general really. And Antony really does trust Herod, and Herod's pretty secure as long as Antony is alive. The problem is that Antony doesn't stay alive, and Antony doesn't do so well. Herod's doing great over in Palestine, keeping the Parthians away, but Antony has a battle of Actium on September 2nd in 31 BC against Octavian, and Octavian defeats Antony. And he emerges to be the ruler of the Roman world. There's no question about that. Herod then meets with Octavian. He goes out to the Isle of Rhodes, and he meets with Octavian on the Isle of Rhodes, and he wins his favor over. Actually, Octavian doesn't really care too much about Herod. He doesn't really care too much about Palestine. He just needs somebody out there who he's his friend. And he saw Herod as a worm, as a guy that was kind of slippery, slidey, and that would remain loyal to whatever Roman official was in place and as long as it benefited him. Herod, which is very true, that's actually a good deduction to make about Herod. And so he was as good as anybody else. In fact, he was better because he trusted that as long as he was ruling Rome, which Herod really had no control over, Herod was going to be loyal to whoever was ruling. Octavian confirms that indeed Herod would remain to be the king of Judea. And so that is that. Octavian now is the ruler of the Roman world, and he has declared that yes, indeed, Herod would remain in power in Judea. So the armies after this battle at Actium, which Antony is defeated at, which we see on the screen, he flees, and he flees to Cleopatra. And he flees to Alexandria, which is the capital, of course, of Egypt, and that's where Cleopatra would have lived. And he's determined, and Cleopatra is getting pretty tired of this, and she knows of the defeat of Antony, and she really is in sort of a precarious position, and so she decides that she's going to rid herself of Antony once and for all, that now Antony has lost this battle and she really needs to rid herself of him. So she barricades herself with two of her handmaidens inside this monument, and making Antony believe that she has committed suicide. And so Antony then attempts to end his own life. He thrusts the sword into his side, but he lives. That's, a lot of people aren't very good at suicide. He was one of them. So Cleopatra and her women, they see what's being done, and they understand what's happening, and they pull this very wounded Antony into the monument. Later, his corpse is found in there by the Romans in that place, and Cleopatra has fled with her handmaidens in order to save her own life. Octavian enters Alexandria on August 1st, 30 BC. And Cleopatra meets him. She tries to charm him. She has certainly held Mark Antony's attention for many, many years at this point, and she figures that she might be able to do the same for Octavian, but he's not interested in her. And that's a problem for Cleopatra. Cleopatra's death is sort of a mystery. It is a mystery. She was found dead. She was in her royal robes. The story is, and of course we've heard this through the years, that she voluntarily was killed by an asp, a snake, that she had asked for these snakes to be brought to her in these baskets, and they were brought to her secretly. It's what was widely believed, and she just allowed these snakes to bite her so that she would die. It's unknown. It's not that is the way the story goes. Small marks apparently were discovered on her arms and her body that would be consistent with snake bites. The snakes, I'm sure, had fled, and they were not present when her body was found. And so it would be hard. I'm sure it was hard for them to deduct at that time exactly what had happened. But that is what is thought to have happened to Cleopatra. So now Mark Antony is dead, Cleopatra is dead, and Herod has Octavia's support for him to stay king there in Judea. So the death of Cleopatra, the conquest of Egypt by Octavian, it strengthens Herod's hand in Palestine. Herod's given the possessions of lands that had been Cleopatra's since the day of Ptolemies. So since the Ptolemies, Octavian added other cities, and Herod now ruled a country that was equal to size that it had been during the Hasmonean days. And so it's quite large, actually. In fact, it's going to be divided, as we know, among his sons, which then begins our biblical text history. But it is quite a large area, and it is divided when Herod dies between his sons. He's plagued at home, of course. Herod never is secure in his duties and responsibilities of being king, because, of course, he's always placating to the Jews and at the ssame time trying to placate to the Romans, who have very little understanding of who the Jews are or what they mean to anybody. He has Mariamne put to death. He charges her with adultery. and he thinks that she's attempted to kill him with poison, so he puts her to death. He executes her mother, Alexandra, for forming a plot against Herod. His allegiance to Rome grows even stronger and ever stronger as his confidence in Octavian and Octavian's power is his only defense against his unpopularity with the Jews. I mean, he's got to please somebody. And so it's going to have to be the Romans. The Jews hate him even more, of course, because the stronger allegiances he has with Rome, the Jews have bigger problems with him. Let's just look at some of the things that affect the Gospels and certainly the book of Acts as well, because, of course, we know that Paul is brought to Caesarea and spends days there as he's waiting for trial to be sent over to Rome to be tried by Caesar. But Herod has great accomplishments. And actually, Herod was a builder. He was quite a builder. And whole cities were rebuilt. Samaria became Sebastia, and in honor of Augustus. He takes Stratton Towers and it becomes Caesarea. He builds a wall with 10 towers on it. It's actually Caesarea, one of the greatest ports there in the Mediterranean. Herod is responsible for that. Northeast of Joppa, he builds Antipatres. He really is quite the builder. Fortresses are built throughout Judea. Gymnasiums, baths, parks, marketplaces, streets. He was an infrastructure king. Luxurious Hellenistic cultural things were part of Herod's building program and would have affected Jewish life during the days of Jesus, because of course he's still the king when Jesus is born. Around 19 BC, around the time that Mary is born, Jesus's mother is born, Herod begins work on the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, he's pretty determined that he's going to get this done because he thinks that this will really be what brings those, particularly Pharisees and the Sadducees, into line for really supporting him to be the king. If he can just build this temple and make it quite magnificent and allow them to have the worship that they want to have there. The temple proper, the innermost part. So if you look at this picture, obviously the part that looks like the old tabernacle area past the court of women, that court of women is that part with the circle there. That's the court of women there in the temple. But beyond that gate there that's at the top of those round stairs, that would be where the altar of burnt offering is. And then of course we know the Holy of Holies and then the most holy. The holy place, and then the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, behind the doors in that structure there. So that innermost part is built within a short period of time. In fact, there's no interruption to worship, actually, no interruption to the daily sacrifices. He is able to build this in pretty quick order. And the priest and the Levites begin to work and worship and conduct the festivals and feasts there within that inner part of that temple. It would take 8 more years to finish the courts. The temple was arranged in terrace form with one court higher than the other, and the temple was the highest of all. And of course, we know that this was on the mound. Anytime in the scriptures, Jerusalem is spoken of people traveling in and out of it, it is always going up to Jerusalem and down to the other place, because always you were going up into the highest point. And so Herod does try to appease the Jews. The outer courts were open to the Gentiles. So this temple was bigger than any temple that the Jews had had in times past. So if you look at the courts, you've got the inner courts of the Jews, and then on the outer courts, which would have been where a lot of the teaching in the book of Acts and even the days of Jesus would have been, and where the money changers were, who would have had to change money for the temple taxes, and we'll talk about all that in the Harmony of the Gospels, those who sold the animals in order that people could have a sacrifice, which was approved by the priest. All of that would have been in those outer courts. Gentiles would have been allowed to come into those courts. And so as we begin to study the Gospels, we'll want to be sure that we understand the temple structure and where people would have been and what would have been happening. And so you see, this is a pretty good picture of the courts. So that inner court there with the circular pattern on mosaic on the floor part, that would have been the court of women, for the women. And so Mary would have brought her offering and purification, and Jesus for purification, to that court and up those stairs to meet the priest. So anyway, really interesting. The court of women, the inner court, the Israelites provided the respectability for men and women to approach more closely this sacred temple and the precincts of worship. And then there were areas that, of course, the priests were the only ones that were allowed to go into. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say here. The sanctuary had everything that could appease the eye. I tell you, the temple that Herod built for the Jews to come into and worship was really spectacular. And they really had not been able to really do what Herod did for them. Herod saw fit that there would be enough glory and enough spectacular structural pieces to this temple that the Jews would be appeased. And at the same time, may I say, he also made sure that the Romans were appeased. And if you look at the far right side of this picture, you see the fortress of Antonia, which was where the Roman garrison would be. It's where Agrippa and the other rulers would have sat and watched as sacrifices were offered, and they would make sure that the guards would make sure that there was peace kept within the temple. It's where Paul is taken to in order to defend him from the Jews who were about to kill him. And so this is really an interesting thing. So having built this temple, Herod took pains to make sure that it would be run without any problems of any kind. And so he appointed the high priest. He appointed, there were rulers in the synagogue, in the temple. There were captains of the temple and captain guards, guards, and in order to keep order. So there were sort of temple policemen, there were temple watchmen. And we'll talk about that as we go through the testaments. But it is interesting to think about what Jerusalem was like in the times that Jesus was born. I want to bring out a few more points about the temple and Herod. Herod was still working on the surrounding buildings of the temple in the days of Jesus, in John the 2nd chapter in verse 20. There was construction going on in that temple until about 64 AD, just a few years prior to to the time when Titus, the Roman, will come in and destroy the whole thing for once and for all with his enemies, and destroy Jerusalem. And so it has work going on in it throughout the days of Jesus and throughout the days of the book of Acts. Herod's sons, by Mariamne, Aristobulus, and Alexander, they were educated in Rome. They openly boasted that they would kill all of the enemies of their mother who came to the throne. And Antipas, Herod Antipas, who later will become one of the Herods that we get to know so well. He's the son of Herod the Great's first wife, named Doris. He wanted Alexander and Aristobulus killed and eliminated as rivals. And so Antipas convinces Herod that his sons are against him, and Alexander and Aristobulus are both executed by their father. And so it kind of leads us to this chart. This is a chart that Russ made, and I want to share it because I think it's a really good way to think about the Herod. So Herod the Great was born in 73 BC. He reigned from 37 to 4 BC. He married 10 wives. He sent the wise men to find the Christ, and he slaughters the Hebrew babies that exist in Bethlehem. When he dies, of course, he's killed two of his sons. He kills Aristobulus and Alexander. Aristobulus is on this chart only because Aristobulus is the father of Agrippa, who, of course, we know will kill James, the brother of John, and also will imprison Peter and will die at the hand of God by worms in Acts the 12th chapter. And so Aristobulus, while he's killed and he's gone and he's dead, his son will play into this. Agrippa also, of course, as we know, has a sister named Herodias. And Herodias, of course, is the one who is married to Philip I, who is one of Aristobulus's brothers, but who has an adulterous relationship with Herod Antipas, who will have John the Baptist put to death. So those are all things that are interesting. I think this is a great chart. We will use this chart again in the Harmony of the Gospels. But while Aristobulus is dead, Agrippa will be one who is still alive, and he will be, and he is a descendant, as is Herodias, of that Maccabee Hasmonean line. So that gets us to where we are. We've got Herod the Great well on his throne. He has now rebuilt, or has begun the rebuilding of the temple, which will be the temple that Mary and Joseph come to early on in the Gospels. He will be the king that is so insecure about Jesus and the birth of Jesus, and the knowledge, especially that the wise men alert him to when Jesus is just 2 years old. His son will, Archelaus, will be the one who is the cause of Joseph and Mary having to go around or go through and go up to Nazareth rather than going back to Bethlehem, which is likely what they would have done. But the Holy Spirit warns them and they go back up. And they do that because Archelaus, the brother of Antipas, and one of the other sons of Herod, is ruling in Judea at that time, and he is oppressing the Jews. And for fear of death, that spirit will tell them to go back up, and that's how Jesus ends up in Nazareth. And we'll look at all that in the gospel messages. So there we are. That's a brief and very quick summary of the years that lie from captivity, the end of the Old Testament, to open the curtains to the stage of the New Testament. And I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope it's helpful. I hope it makes you understand and helps you understand where the synagogues have come from and why they were so important to the Jews, who the Pharisees and Sadducees were, how they ended up being sort of the rulers of the temple, the Sadducees, and the rulers of the synagogues, the Pharisees, the animosity that they had, and yet how they would unite against the Messiah is very interesting. And who these Herods were, and who these people that we see playing into the lives of those that we love so well in the Gospels. And of course, the world is ready now. They're under Roman rule. There's somewhat religious freedom within the territory of Palestine now. Samaria is still set there in the middle of Galilee and Judea. It is not part, it has been pulled out and is not part and is not compliant to the laws that the Israelites follow at this time. And so, all right, so we will start on a study of the harmony of the Gospels now that we have these years in place. I hope you've enjoyed the study. Look forward to the harmony of the Gospels.